The Wizard Returns, Chapter 2. "Wake up," said an insentient voice in his ear. "It's time." He had no interest in doing so. He'd been having the most lovely dream, floating in a warm, honey-scented bath while colorful balloons sailed by overhead, and a beautiful talking lion sang lullabies in a voice that rivaled the great blues singers of his homeland. But the voice would not let him sink back into glorious oblivion. "I mean it," it said, more firmly this time. "Wake up." He opened his eyes and found himself staring into a pair of uncanny emerald ones. Emerald. There was something about that color that he couldn't quite put his finger on. His own eyes refused to focus properly, and he only wanted to go back to sleep, but the person in front of him was now tugging fiercely at his shoulder. "We have to get you out of here," Emerald Eyes said. "You're high as a kite." "Balloon," he mumbled, allowing himself to be dragged along as the man hoisted one arm over his shoulder and towed him through. Where was he? His vision was improving a little, but there was more color all around him, red and green, and overhead a lot of blue. A sky, he remembered. The thing overhead was a sky. He protested feebly as he pulled away from the last of the huge red flowers and dumped incrementally into a grassy hillock. Emerald Eyes smacked him briskly on the cheeks. When this did nothing to wake him up, he heaved a sigh of disgust and let him go. "Nighty-night," he murmured, and drifted off to sleep again. The next time he woke up, it was early in the morning, and the pleasant fuzziness had faded to a dull buzz. He was in a cornflower blue field, under a bright blue sky. He sat up and looked around. A patch of fat pink flowers sat next to him and were singing a cheerful, high-pitched ditty. Two huge yellow and black butterflies fluttered lazily through the air, arguing half-heartedly about who was the better looking. Emerald Eyes was stretched out with his back against a nearby tree watching him. "Good," he said. "You're awake. The poppy should be wearing off now that you're out of the field. Do you know where you are?" Emerald Eyes cocked his head. "Do you know who you are?" He considered the questions. There was the dream about the lion, but before that everything was a hazy blur. He had a vague sense that flowers did not ordinarily sing and butterflies were not meant to talk. But that was it. "Not really," he admitted. Emerald Eyes looked at him for a long time. "You're the wizard," he said finally. "Not that you were ever really good at being one, but we can't call you that on the journey we're about to take. You really don't remember, do you?" Wizard? He didn't know anything about being a wizard. Something stirred in his memory. A card table. He'd sat at a card table and done sleight-of-hand tricks and passed a battered top hat, a shabby one-room apartment that smelled of cabbages, his face in the mirror sallow and pale with dark circles under his eyes, a young face but hardened and cynical, a brown suit with fraying cuffs, worn shiny at the elbows, and underneath it a stained white shirt with a collar that has long lost its crispness. He shook his head violently, and the image dissipated into wisps of smoke. "I played tricks," he said uncertainly. Emerald Eyes laughed, and there was something in the sound that was almost bitter or cruel. "That you certainly did," he said. "For the time being, let's call you—" He trailed off, thinking, and then smiled. "Let's call you Hex," he said with a grin. "And you can call me Pete, though you used to know me as something else." "I did?" the wizard asked. No, he wasn't a wizard. This strange boy had just told him as much. Hex. His name was Hex now. He studied Pete closely, and something flickered in the back of his mind. A baby? A monkey? And then the flicker died down, and whatever he'd been about to remember was gone. "You did," Pete said, "but that was a long time ago. Do you have any idea how long you've been down in on that poppy field? 25 years, my friend, give or take a few. You should be an old man by now. But as you know, or used to know anyway, time doesn't move the same way in Oz that it does in your world, and time definitely doesn't move the same way in a poppy field." Pete sighed. Kind of jealous, actually. A quarter-century blissed-out nap sounds pretty good right now. You wouldn't believe how much work it took to get out of the palace. The only reason I could get away was because Dorothy is so wrapped up in whatever she's up to with Glinda. Anyway, I've been sent to help you get home. Sent? By who? Hex thought more about what Pete had just said. The name Dorothy had set up a tiny alarm in his brain, though he wasn't sure why. Where is home if it isn't here? The other place, Pete said impatiently. You were trying to get there when your balloon crashed. That's where you were from, and that's where you belong. But you can't cross the boundary between here and there until your memory returns. The fairies are the only people in Oz that can help you, which is why I'm not taking you to them. But they won't help you without getting something in exchange. And they'll test you to make sure you're worthy of their assistance. Test? Hex asked nervously. What kind of test? The 3-part test, Pete said. Wisdom, courage, and love. It's part of our journey. I can guide you to the fairy kingdom, but you'll have to pass the test on your own to prove your selflessness. The fairies won't help you unless they believe it's for the good of Oz. Test? Other place? Fairies? What Pete was saying didn't make sense at all. And why did Pete care if he stayed here or went to what was supposedly his home? And if he thought about it for too long, his head hurt. Oh, why now? He asked suddenly. Why didn't you just leave me to sleep? Pete pulled Hex to his feet, ignoring his protests. It's time to start walking, he said. No one will be looking for you, or expect to see you here wandering around, but we can't take any chances. Why does it matter if anyone recognizes me? Before Hex even realized what was happening, Pete had taken hold of his face in both hands, staring deep into his eyes, with his own uncanny green ones. Hold still, Pete said. This might hurt. He pushed his palms into Hex's cheek with a terrible cracking sound. The sudden flare of pain was overwhelming, and Hex uttered a muffled yell. He could feel the bones of his skull shifting in Pete's hands, almost unbearably hot now. He continued to push in his cheeks and jaws. His skin was burning. His scalp felt as though he might peel away from his skull in flayed pieces, his teeth as though they were crumbling in his jaw. Tears sprung from his eyes, and a flash of contempt crossed Pete's face. Before he finally took his hands away, Hex sank to his knees, gasping for breath, and touched his face, afraid of what he'd find there. The skin was cool and ordinary to the touch, the agony lessened to a dull throb. I could have just glamored you, Pete said, but this will last longer. I'd show you in a mirror, but I don't have one. And anyway, you don't remember what you looked like before, but trust me, no one in Oz is going to recognize you now. Hex rubbed his jaw, wincing as the remembered pain. You will need new clothes, too, Pete added, tossing him a pair of pants and a shirt that he'd somehow summoned out of thin air, and then pointedly turning his back. For a moment, Hex changed into new clothes. They fit him perfectly. He carefully folded the clothes he'd been wearing and cleared his throat. Pete turned around, and Hex handed Pete his old suit. Pete snapped his fingers, and the clothes disappeared. Thanks, he said, and laughed. Pete looked at him in surprise. You're welcome, he said. Let's get going. Pete was already walking away from him, striding briskly through the tall, pale blue grass. Hex stumbled after him, his mind blurring with questions. Why? After 25 years, had Pete woken him up now? Why did it matter if anyone recognized him? Who was Pete? And why did he call Hex a wizard? Who were the fairies? And why was Pete taking him to them? Hex stared at Pete's back and sighed. It didn't take a wizard to know his questions weren't going to be answered anytime soon.